Okay, video 2 for week 11. Actually, this is just a few thoughts and reflections on, I've read all your posts for week 10 about adolescent development, specifically the article about Tabitha, and I loved reading your posts on risk and protective factors. It can be really hard to see protective factors when somebody's got so many layers. I mean, intersectionality, right? So many layers of struggles, like she and her family have. But I loved seeing, your bullet point lists of just some things that I wouldn't have thought of. I mean, I think her risk factors are pretty clear, and they're not all individual. Most of them are, her community, her family. But I loved your ability to point out and see her strengths, which are, some of her protective factors. Which leads into the second question, which was comparing her story or her circumstances to the novel, to The Hate U Give. I felt like I realized that my perception of Garden Heights is that, yes, it's a community that struggles, but there's a lot worse communities than Garden Heights. I mean, better or worse, I don't know, just different, but you see so much strength in Garden Heights, and part of that is that we're looking at it through the lens of Star's family, who are, very intentional, active, compassionate people with very obvious strengths. But I felt like reading this article about the young woman in New York City made Garden Heights seem like a really nice place to live. And I do really think that the main difference is the connection to community, family, certainly. But, with all the moves that Tabitha has to make, she just doesn't have a lot of connection. She doesn't have community. Her family doesn't have support, and who knows how different her own family would be in terms of supporting each other if they had, a community around them of people that are supportive. And it would be interesting, as some of you mentioned, wishing you could catch up on her story and know where she ended up. To see if especially her very youngest sibling, who's only 2 at the time of the article, how different her experience is. It sounds like the mom's second marriage is better, and she's in a church, community, and she's got people around her who are supporting her. And I imagine that the youngest siblings are going to grow up fairly differently from the older siblings. Anyway, just some thoughts. Certainly there's some commonalities in the struggles between Tabitha and Star, and some major differences as well. Star has the luxury of a supportive family and a stable place to live. I do think several of you hit on the idea that Tabitha's choices in her relationships had a lot more to do with safety and security than they did with risky sexual behavior, if you want to call it that. So anyway, just some of my thoughts. I really enjoyed reading your thoughts. I wanted to comment finally on the label at risk. So I started working with youth in about 1990. And I remember at that time, at risk was a new, or maybe it was even a little bit later than that. It was a pretty new way of describing things. And maybe this was me by being naive, but I felt like before that, a lot of the labels or the ways of referring to groups of young people who, needed social services was really stigmatizing and really based on describing their problem behaviors or putting diagnostic labels on them or, calling them troubled youth or those kinds of things. And I feel like at the beginning, when the term at risk came along, the idea of saying these kids are at risk was like trying to get people to do something about it. It put the onus on the community, on the social services providers, on the adults, on the decision makers to say, look, these kids are at risk. If we don't do something to help them, they are going to be in big trouble. And so from that standpoint, it felt like it was a call to action. And certainly, and now at this point, you know, we seem to be living in a time where we blame everybody for their problems, you know, kind of like the poverty discussion, like, oh, well, it's your fault if you're poor. You know, if you had done a better job of, I don't know, whatever, making different choices, maybe you wouldn't be in poverty. So I feel like that's what at-risk has become. It's become very stigmatized. But I don't think that was the intention in the beginning. And the reason I bring this up is to say, language changes, and over the course of your career in social work, and those of you who have already been in the field, I'm sure have seen this, you will see that language changes. You know, the way that we refer to certain people groups. You know, if we look, I mean, even, you know, because we're talking about Black communities with both Tabitha's community and the Hate U Give, you know, over the last 60 years, I haven't been alive for 60 years, but over the last 60 years, the terminology that is considered appropriate and respectful has changed multiple times. That's just one example. Certainly the language is changing rapidly around the LGBTQ and trans community, right? Like, as social workers, instead of getting frustrated that people are too focused on our language, we recognize that language is really powerful, that language is alive and it changes, and so we can't just stick with the old ways of describing things and expect people to know what we mean. Doesn't mean we need to be, you know, overly fearful that we're going to use the wrong language, but language certainly matters. So I don't know that at promise is going to stick, but the reality that at risk used to be a positive term and no longer is, I think it's just how things go. And so we learn to stay caught up as much as we can. It's just like using best practices, right? Language is part of our use of best practices. Anyway, those are just my thoughts about that. And I look forward to seeing more and talking more in future weeks about, you know, what the social worker's role is in helping, you know, people who don't have access to the resources that others do to soar. I love that idea of, you know, this young woman wanting to soar and thinking in terms of what can we do on all the levels, micro, meso, macro, and in our personal lives to help people soar. So that's all. Hopefully that's helpful. I talked a lot longer than I meant to, but hopefully you get something out of that discussion. And again, email me if you have questions, but I should be caught up with posting and publishing all of the grades by the end of this week, so you can know exactly where you stand. And if you have more questions about the critical reflection, shoot me an email and I'll answer as quickly as I can. All right? Thanks.